documentary record of research. We are privileged to have her as a colleague and as one of the staff, and I'm sure the students realise how lucky they are to have Judith teaching them. She has so many fields of research interest that I'm going to let her tell you about those, because somebody asked me today why I haven't put my profile up on the web, and I read this and thought, now I know why. Might never do it. But it is wonderful that Judith has given her time today to present this lecture. I know that you are going to find it extremely interesting and thought-provoking, because anyone who's engaged in discussion with Judith knows that she always gets you thinking. I've known Judith for a number of years. We've been involved in a number of committees and organisations together and have friends in common, and she always gets me thinking, but she always reminds me about why it's so great to be in early childhood. And I'm sure you will find that too. So Judith, thank you for today, and I'm sure you will not be disappointed. Kia ora.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that generous introduction. Now, can you hear me all right? I'm wired for sound. I've got 2 of them. And so I'm going to have to behave, but I'm packed tightly so I can leap around and do my usual moving around quite a lot. So I'm appreciative for that. Thank you so much for coming on this very cold, dark, horrible day. So it's lovely to see so many friendly faces here. And as Linda has said, that I'm hoping to challenge you with some ideas today, to introduce you to some passions of mine in terms of early childhood, and to pose some issues that I want you to think about and talk with your colleagues about for those who aren't here. But if you can take some of these ideas away and have a bit of a thrash with them, that would be great. The topic that I've been working up to talk to you today about is early childhood education at the heart of community wellness. And the discussion that I'm going to have with you today is that early childhood education is more than just early education for children, but it plays a key role in families' lives, and even more so in building well communities. And this is an emerging idea that early childhood is playing internationally, and it's one that I really want to talk through with you today. So my argument's going to be shaped around how do early childhood centres and early childhood services do this. They do it in many ways, and I'm going to talk through these ideas with you over the next little while. By supporting families, by allowing families to share their experiences, knowledge and skills with each other, by providing opportunities for families to develop relationships and relationships with other community agencies, social services. And most importantly of all, early childhood centres, when they are functioning well, build good networks and connections between people. And we know from the resilience literature, from the community-based literature, that it's these kinds of links that make healthy communities, healthy families, healthy children. Right, for those of you who are early childhood audience, you will know that what I'm talking about is the non-compulsory provision of education and care for 0 to 5-year-olds. And so my studies I'm talking about do stop at 5 years. When I'm talking about early childhood services, I'm talking about the many different styles of philosophy and provision that we have at this time in New Zealand. And I'm also talking about a large percentage of our children as well. And if you can squint up there and see those tiny little numbers, you can see that the numbers of children who are directly accessing services in New Zealand is quite high. And so one of the best features of our early childhood services is it's a non-targeted, universalised service already being accessed by children and families. So we already know from all kinds of research and literature, both nationally and internationally, that early childhood education makes a huge difference for children. We've got research coming out of our ears that positive long and short-term outcomes come for children from attending early childhood education. And I'll say good early childhood and quality early childhood education. We know already that it can ameliorate the effects of poverty and risk for children. And certainly most of the research that has focused on children who are from disadvantaged or disabled communities have shown that the effects are much greater for them. But what I want to pose to you today is that early childhood education should be considered as a really valuable part of the solutions to many of the problems that face our modern families at this time. Now, we've already known for about the last 10 years that having your child attend an early childhood centre is a great thing for parents. And so Kathy Wiley, who's part of NZCER, when she did a literature review on the outcomes of early childhood education way back last century in 1994, she was able to show that in fact by having your child in an early childhood centre, you actually had much better enhanced relationships with your own children, just through the effect of your child and you participating in the centre. She was able to show that it alleviated maternal stress. Parents who actually were taking some time out from their children and were being involved in the centre noticed these. She also showed in 1994 that upgrading of education and improving employment status was also some of the byproducts of attending an early childhood centre. And they carried on looking quite closely at this in the Competent Children study, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with. And in the report of Competent Children at 5, they focused on the impact that having good quality early childhood education for their children had on the parents. And again, they found that parents were finding support, friendship and company through attending early childhood centres with their children. And importantly, they were gaining a better understanding of their own children. And as a byproduct of that, they were improving their own parental skills. And these are things that often you hear today in the media about how we need parenting programs and parenting education and why can't parents do it better. Well, for these parents who were involved in their local early childhood centre, they were accessing these kinds of supports. Now, we've also got some key documents in early childhood which actually point us in the way of working more holistically and in more of a collaborative way with parents. Te Whāriki, our early childhood curriculum, talks about the importance of families and community being part of everything that we do in early childhood in our curriculum. Pathways to the Future, which was the 10-year strategic plan for early childhood education, and I say was because we're not kind of sure of its status at the moment, but it sent out a really strong message about working collaboratively between parents and children and social services and schools, that early childhood centres should really be part of collaborative relationships at all times. So we've got some nice policy directives as well as the research behind us. So if we look at our current context in New Zealand at the moment, there's many of us who would argue that early childhood centres are now well suited to adopt a whole new role which moves beyond just a child-centred program focus. And I'm just going to take a minute to read what Hayden and MacDonald wrote about. Now, they were talking about the Australian context, and I know we're different from Australia, but I think the messages are really clear for us as well. They argue, this is Hayden and MacDonald, that it's time to transcend the traditional discourses that view early childhood centres as support for working parents, as compensatory programs for children with disadvantage, or as programs for developing school readiness. How often do we hear our early childhood services talk just like that here in New Zealand? So they argue that by changing attitudes and policies, early childhood services can be reformulated to assume the critical task of developing and facilitating social relationships, networks and collaborations. And they go on to talk about how it's really important to have a community-orientated approach to anything that's occurring in an early childhood service. Well, if we think about that argument, we know that parent participation is linked to positive outcomes. There is a whole bunch of OECD reports that have been produced over the last 10 years that have argued that early childhood education can really strengthen and build both communities and very strong families. So there's been an international awareness of all of this for quite some time. If we think about our New Zealand context, in the 1990s we saw a lot of cutbacks in terms of community resources. So your local Plunket Centre, your public health nurse, your post office, places where people used to coalesce in communities, in suburbs, were removed. And sometimes they were removed from our areas in New Zealand that most needed to have a community heart. Likewise, many small schools were closed not long after that. And if you talk to small communities, they often say that the school was the heart of their community. And when that closed, they were left with quite a gap. What hasn't been acknowledged is that when all of those other things closed, the early childhood centres actually were still there. And in many cases, particularly community-based services, they are still there. Now, Purdue, MacArthur and Ballard, talking about children with disabilities, have argued for quite some time that participation in early childhood education is an early intervention strategy. Thank you, Kerry. So there are some recent moves to reconceptualise early childhood as more than just a preschool experience. And it's the reconceptualising we're going to focus on. Now, I'm happy to see that the Ministry of Education and the Ministry of Social Development, yes, the silos can come together, got together a few years ago and have been piloting what they call the Early Childhood Education Centre-Based Parent Support and Development Project. Now, this has been a fabulous project where for 18 centres they have funded them to provide a range of different styles of parent support. So some of them have had social workers attached, some of them have had parents who have worked in the community, some of them have got teachers who have taken on additional, almost like social work roles, but not quite. There's been a whole lot of different models. There's been playgroups, there's been IT classes, there's been a whole range of different models being trialled, all based out of an early childhood centre. So instead of an early childhood centre sending parents off to a whole lot of other services around the place, they've been based at the early childhood centre. And the reason they've done that is because the early childhood centre is in the community where the families are, and it's the safe zone. It's where the parents were already accessing every day to take their child. So suddenly to find that there was another service coming out of a safe place for them has actually worked exceedingly well. And I'll do my wee political speech here. This was funded as a pilot, and it was funded by our previous government. So for this work to continue, there needs to be enough people that think it's a good idea. So I'll just leave it there. All right, now what I want to do, as well as say those are fabulous pilots, is talk to you about 4 research studies that I've been a part of that have been really exploring the notion of where does early childhood fit in terms of our community, in terms of our culture, and in terms of really how we can build a much stronger country and much stronger families. The first one, which you'll hear quite a bit about, is from a study funded by the Ministry of Social Development. And it was myself, Chris Bowden from the Victoria University of Wellington, and Anne Smith from the Children's Issues Centre. And it was a 2-year study where we focused on looking at how early childhood centres support family resilience. So I had this theory that they did. And so luckily the Ministry of Social Development decided that they might like to find out if they did as well. So we were funded to go into centres that were what they called in the least deprived areas. So what we did was we used the deprivation index, which is a little bit different from the socio-economic one. It actually takes into account things like if you own a car, if you've got telephone, a more general understanding of where families fit within New Zealand society. So we case studied 3 kindergartens, 3 case study centres, 2 kindergartens and 1 childcare centre. There was a kindergarten in Wellington, a kindergarten in Gisborne and a full-day centre in Dunedin. And what we looked at was we wanted to see what it was that teachers were doing on an everyday basis, not doing anything different, not having any additional staffing, just good practice. What was that doing for the families? We interviewed 20 families in total, 15 early childhood staff, and 13 representatives of advisory support services. So these were the people that the centre staff used on a regular basis to support families, so we talked to those. And then we put researchers in the 3 centres, and they followed the teachers around for 3 months, recording the kinds of interactions that were going on between teachers and parents, and parents and parents. Another study that I, again, was lucky enough to be part of, which was a TLRI-funded study, was looking at under 3-year-olds in kindergarten. And Carmen Daly from Victoria University of Wellington and myself and a whole heap of teachers got together on this one. We tracked 18 2-year-olds who were attending 4 kindergartens, and we followed them over 6 months of their starting of kindergarten, and we did it over 2 years. And while the focus of the study was to actually look at what 2-year-olds were experiencing in kindergartens, when we talked with parents, we got a whole different story about the role that being suddenly part of a kindergarten community meant for the whole family. And that was kind of an unexpected finding, which I'm going to share with you today. The third one is a centre of innovation, which we've just recently finished. Citizens Preschool and Nursery, which is a early childhood centre in Dunedin, and it's just changed its name to, and I'm looking for you, the Methodist Mission Early Learning Centre. Thank you. They've just changed their name to that just last year. It was a 3-year funded project where we were looking at integrating a social worker into the early childhood program. And we were looking at, well, what works when you're introducing a social worker into what has been a non-social work environment. And the last one is my sort of passion project at the moment. New Zealand kindergarten's just another early childhood service or a distinctive part of New Zealand culture. I've been following this study up for a couple of years, wanting to know what New Zealanders currently think about kindergartens. Is it something as a philosophy we want to hold on to? Is it a service we want to maintain? Or is it just another, in a very kind way, early childhood service with no distinction? And in this particular study, I've been doing it over a couple of years, as I said, I've talked with all 32 general managers, 60 senior teachers, 71 teachers, 61 parents, and more than 60 50-plus-year-olds to get their opinion on kindergarten. So there's still lots of findings to come from that one, and you'll probably hear me speak about those at another time. But again, the feeling of what being part of a community, an early childhood community, means for parents is the findings from those ones as well. So I've put all of these 4 studies together in the interest of time this evening, and you're going to get a bit of a potted version of what it all means. So, no surprises. The parents have told us that, in fact, attending an early childhood centre for their child and being involved themselves has been supportive. What has been supportive? First of all, the fact that they've had what they've called trusting, caring and stable relationships. And that's between the teachers and the children and the teachers and the parents. Given the huge amount of instability that we can have in early childhood with changing staff, I think some of these findings are really important. And I'd like you to keep that in your mind as you're listening to these. What does it mean when we're having high turnover of staff in centres, where we have centres that are not sustainable, so that we cannot guarantee that they will be there next year if the owner changes or the corporate decides to sell them on. So think about some of those sorts of, for those of you who can, think about some of those realities that are happening in centres and then what this would mean for these key findings. Alright, the parents told us that when they were in a centre that actually actively promoted family involvement, that actually built those relationships. That introducing families to each other was a key finding, and that connecting families and outside agencies enabled families to have links wider than themselves, and I'm going to talk about these as I go. So when you're talking about building relationships, That's sort of the cornerstone of early childhood centres. We say all the time we're building relationships. But the key to those building relationships actually seemed to be very simple when I listened to the parents. They talked about actually having just a welcoming, positive environment when you went in. Somebody who noticed you when you arrived. It gave you as a parent a sense of safety about leaving your child there. It gave your child a sense of safety about being there. And it gave your whole family a sense of belonging. And I know we're really good at identifying children when they come in and saying hi, but I wonder how many times we forget to say hello to the parents. This parent says it very well. They're very welcoming. Like when you walk in the gate and you walk in the door, they greet every child by name, and that child's made to feel quite special. My kid, she gets quite embarrassed, but she loves it, absolutely loves it. You can just picture it, can't you? The fact that someone would single her out and say, hello, that makes her feel quite good, and it makes us feel good. Like it makes you feel part of the centre, really. And another parent said, what really convinced me to leave my child was the teacher. She was the primary caregiver to him. She picked him up and gave him a big kiss. And I thought, I just want someone who's going to love him, someone who's going to teach him and care for him. So it was that feeling that it was the right place. He was happy, I was happy. So as soon as that relationship is firmly in place, the child feels safe, the parent feels safe, then in fact the other things add on naturally and flow naturally from them. So the parents and the teachers identified for us over the studies that the way their parenting was being supported was from these things. Being able to share information, and share information at a really timely time. Not that this week everybody's doing toileting, so all the pamphlet goes up about toileting, but actually responding to the parent who says, I'm just starting to do toileting now, have you got any information? So it's that appropriateness and that timing was really important. Role modelling. The parents watching teachers actually dealing with their own child in a different way, gave them lots of suggestions of how they too could deal with their child, particularly in some of those crisis moments of temper tantrums, etc. Informal discussion came from all of the studies. It was those conversations that parents had on the way in and the way out that were the key conversations that they gained insight about their child and their own parenting that helped them, and often it was those informal conversations that led to connecting one parent with another parent who might have then become a friend later on. Interestingly too, we found that the inclusion of parents in the program happened more naturally, of course, in kindergarten. And so the advantages for parents of being a kindergarten parent were much larger than parents who are in childcare who can't spend the amount of time that kindergarten parents can. And this is something I think we need to think quite carefully about as less and less parents are participating in the program, how we can replicate some of these other things for them when they can't actually be there for a part of every day. Here's a parent that says it's quite well. Well, I've watched them with the children and seen what they're like with the children, what they do, and they get ideas, and I get ideas from them. If I've got something that's bothering me, I'll ask them about it. You know, it's kind of important, particularly parents at home. You don't get that from anyone, that feedback she's talking about. You go to work and someone says, great job or bad job, do it better. Whereas when you're a parent, no one does that for you. No one pats you on the back and says, you're doing a good job. And it's kind of good to get feedback from the teachers because they know where they're coming from. They've seen it all before. So for this parent, when she got the you're doing a great job, it meant so much to her because she knew that they'd seen 100 other parents go through what she was going through, and if they thought she was doing a good job, then she really was. All these sorts of things, actually, they seem very small, they seem very incidental, but they were huge in terms of supporting families. One of the interesting things they said, the parents said to us, was that just actually being able to have a break from my child is huge. Not only to have a break to undertake work or study, but actually just gave me, as a mother, some time out. And they talked about how much they enjoyed their children on return. This parent says it, I think, quite well. How does it help my family? Our family means that the pressure is off me every day. I'm the one that's giving, giving, giving. So having him in care, knowing he's cared for, gives me the freedom to have time with, and she had an older child who at that time had leukemia and was dying. I get some time on my own that's even better because I need that support. I needed that time out to do my own thing. I know that the child is getting all the care he needs, he's learning the skills. I haven't got the time to teach him at home, social skills. We don't go to playgroups and things like that. It's so supportive for us knowing that where he's going, he's loved, he's educated, and he's cared for. And it means the rest of us can have our lives. And he can participate in that during the day or not. So it's incredible. And the difference for that family was huge. But importantly, support is only feels support from the person that's getting it. Like, I can't say I can support you because what I do mightn't feel supportive at all to you. It's the person that's receiving it that can say really what support is. And these are the sorts of things that families told us meant that when teachers were doing something, they understood it to be support. That sensitivity to families' stresses and situations, knowing the family well enough to know when things weren't quite right with them and being able to respond appropriately. They told us when teachers took a collaborative approach that was so much more helpful than taking over. So working alongside the parents to work out solutions to problems, to make suggestions, rather than saying, great, I can fix this, come on with me. In this way too, it demonstrated real respect for family differences. And following that family lead, what the family themselves wanted to do, really meant that the amount of support offered felt much more meaningful and respectful, and therefore really felt like support. And this teacher talks about how her attitude sets this up. She was talking about if you're noticing that things aren't going too well with the parent, you can sort of give some very tangible support, and this is her example. She says to have the child prepared if you know that mum's had a stressful day the day before, you know, having the child prepared with all the lost clothes that they might have taken off throughout the day, have them all ready and rearing to go. So that in that way they greet mum in a happy mood, and hopefully mum will be. Mum and dad will pick them up in that same frame of mind. It's the same when parents come in and may have a hassle time, you know, particularly getting like one or two of a couple of our families. They have 3 children, we get them ready to go. So it seems, again, a little thing, but in fact a parent arriving and not having to find the socks, the shoes, the coat, at the end of the day, really establishes good relationship between that parent and that child when they arrive, instead of the, oh, you haven't lost your shoes again. This teacher said, my own personal philosophy is you treat every child as an individual. Nobody's cast in the same mould, and nobody has the same personality or the same behaviour patterns. And it's a show of respect for parents and the children. So she was talking about this in the context that while it might be okay to have the shoes ready for one set of parents, it might not be for the other. And knowing that is about knowing that parent really well and knowing what is going to be helpful and what could be seen as overstepping the mark. A really important task of building community wellness for parents is breaking down isolation. And I've called it here turning isolation into cohesion and communication. And simply being there in the community has been one of the biggest keys. Just by the fact that the Early Childhood Centre has been in the community, when in fact there's been very little other provisions in the community, has been huge. Not that early childhood centres have become the heart of a community like the schools have, but they're certainly playing a significant role in helping that. This parent says, it's a connection thing really. Just it makes me feel I'm not an island. I think that anything that makes you feel part of your community, that makes us feel part of the flow of what happens in the city, that involves the kindergarten, the school, the shops, the library. This parent, by being part of a centre, could actually see how all of those connections connected her and her family and broke down that sense of I'm not an island. So part of breaking down that sense of isolation and making connections is actually building relationships. Not just relationships between you and the parent, because you want them to have relationships that are sustainable once they've moved on from the centre. So you don't want relationships that end up being a trap situation where in fact the relationship is only between you and the parent and then they are bereft when their child goes to school. This parent, I think, talks about it quite well. She says, I think there's a sense of community, not just being part of a family, which I think is important, but the fact you're networking. You might just walk home with another group of kids, in the same direction, or you might meet up in the park and the kids feel like they know other people. She goes on to say, my childcare, I don't have family here, are usually my kindy friends, whereas I didn't know any of the parents at the childcare centre. And this kindergarten parent said, we've used both private and kindergarten. The friendships the kids have made in kindy have been just huge. My son, he's the eldest, is 8.5 and his kindy friends are still the first he invites round to play, even though they're not at the same school. She goes on to say, the big difference I noticed between kindy and childcare centre was you never got to meet the parents of people at the childcare centre. You drop them off at whatever time you're on your way to work or whatever. You've got 5 seconds to drop in and run, and if it doesn't fit in with the same schedule as other people, you never meet other parents. You never feel part of a group, whereas the friendships, we make as a family at kindergarten have been really, really good. So this identifying that I can do it at kindy because I've got more time, but also because I'm dropping my child off at the same time as other parents and collecting them at the same time as other parents gives an immediate advantage. So how do we do this? How do we replicate this for parents who have only the 5 seconds to get in and out? Teaching attitudes and perspectives are a big part of this. What teachers can and cannot make possible is often shaped by what you bring as a teacher to it. When we've talked to teachers across a range of the studies, they've told us things like their sensitivity to family issues and difficulties, that that for the centres that were working well, that was one of the distinctive features that teachers talked lots about. They also talked about that shared concern for the child, and it was a shared concern. It wasn't, I'm concerned about the child, but I don't know what the family's doing. It was about working collaboratively together. They also were teachers who would admit to their own limitations. They wouldn't say they knew everything, and they would admit when they'd made a mistake. And this enabled them to relate and develop a really good rapport with parents, because they were human. And the parents told us so as well. And this parent said, I'm sure she's seen this before, thinking about a child behaviour, and if she hasn't, she'll admit it. You know what I mean? I like that too. The ability to admit mistakes and limitations, that's important to me. And another parent said, she's great, really supportive. We have a rapport. Like some people you just click with. We have a personal rapport. I can talk to her. Pause. I imagine I can talk to her just about anything, and vice versa. I doubt that, and I think that would be good. It's really nice actually having someone you're close to in the sense they're caring for your child. So it always comes back to that sense of safety between the teacher and the child. And this is another example where a parent is talking about another mother, but it's an example where she said, I talked to a mum a few months ago who had no food at home, and they go to the same centre. Her child got fed with Weet-Bix, and then she got a food parcel when she picked him up. But they didn't draw any attention to her. They didn't get any more involved than that either. And, oh, why have you spent your money? What's happened? It's like, maybe it's not that they don't want to know, but it's that they're really respectful of privacy. So I'm quite glad they don't try and get too involved in our personal situation for those reasons, So that mother was able to see that the centre had seen a need, quietly gone about it, just done it, no fuss, no bother, no wanting to know any more details. Now that's a real sign of respect. That's a respectful relationship in action there. And this parent, when she was talking about respectful relations, said, as long as my child's happy, that's all the support I need. Centre's a welcoming place. I feel I can just go and have a drink. I don't feel like I'm interfering or anything like that. To have an environment where my child is happy, learning and developing, that's all I want from the centre. What she missed, though, what she said there, was that she can go in and have a drink. She feels as welcomed as her child, and she's taken that for granted. But that's part of the support that's going on. It feels natural, it feels comfortable, and she didn't even need to identify it, and they do something for me. So, if we start thinking about reconceptualising our relationships, we've got ample evidence, not only from the research that I've done, but from international research, that shows that early childhood centres and staff also provide very effective and valuable support to family members. The problem is, if families only ever see early childhood centres as something that is child-focused, not anything for them, then that's going to be a barrier in how well we can reconceptualise our relationships with families. And this parent, I think, explains it very well. She said, nobody's actually ever said to me what an early childhood centre is supposed to be, is to help your child to develop, in the sense be helping you to help your child. No one's ever said that to me, never. If they'd said that to me at the very beginning, I would have had a very different outlook or whatever. I think the first thing I read was a whole bunch of things about my child developing and other things, but there was nothing there that said, oh, I wasn't aware, I didn't know that that's what they were supposed to be there for, to support families. So that had never, ever come across her awareness that in fact there was anything more to the centre than just for her child. So if that is a perception that's out there, and I have to say it does seem to be a perception that's out there, there is also a handful of parents who really aren't interested either. And there was a sense of gratitude for some of the personal support they were receiving by their child attending, but there were quite a few parents who actually said they didn't really want the teachers to be there personally for them at all. And in fact, family life was private and very inappropriate for teachers to be interested in anything other than the children. So again, I think we have a misunderstanding, however, of early childhood education as needing to be a collaboration between families and the teachers. That it's impossible to teach the child without actually knowing enough about the family so that everybody feels safe and comfortable. So for these families where there was a bit of a barrier, where they didn't actually want to have the centre know too much about them, it may be that there were other things needed to have been put in place for them so they felt more welcome and they felt more at home. When we analysed what the key roles that teachers actually engaged in that were supportive, we were able to give them nice little labels that pulled all the findings together. The first one I've called a supportive mediator, and that was to really work with families to help them to access other resources, help them to deal with neighbourhood disputes, help them to deal with their children, and help their children deal with the siblings as well. Their role really was mediator of a whole lot of interpersonal and relationships really going on both in their home and in their communities. They also could be seen as an information provider. So parents often went to them for a whole range of information, and interestingly enough, over the time difference between the studies, that role was increasing more. Parents were going more and more often for a wider variety of information, from, you know, should I take my child to the doctor, to how do I pay my childcare fees. So there was a whole range of new amounts of information being asked for. As a buffer is a more contentious one, I think, that I've put up there, but teachers often worked as a buffer between social agencies and the families. So they often worked as the one who would mediate in the first instance to introduce them to a social agency, but then have to buffer some of the harm that sometimes contacting outside agencies can do for vulnerable families. So their role as a buffer was huge in the kindergartens and the childcare centres that were in lower socioeconomic areas. They worked very hard to build up strong relationships with their family and then buffer any negative effects that may have come from contacting social services, from contacting Inland Revenue in some cases, or in some cases the local school. So their role as a buffer was quite huge. A provider of coping strategies was another list of behaviours the teachers engaged in. And that was again modelling the ways that parents can cope with some of the more difficult day-to-day activities and events that happen in even the best of families. A referral source and facilitator was huge in all of the settings. All families at some stage often need a referral for additional support for something. We all have time when we have young children that we are vulnerable families, and the Early Childhood Centre is the perfect place to actually make your first inquiry. It's a safe place, it's a universal place, and as I've shown, it's a place where parents already have some good relationships. So teachers find themselves often being the first port of call when parents need or are seeking a bit of advice and guidance. And I like to think too that from all of the studies that I've been looking at, that the early childhood teachers have been really good role models of empowered citizens. In most of the centres that we've been working in, they've been 99% women, showing that women can be strong role models, can take control of their lives and can work positively and well in social relationships. And I think that's been really important in many of our centres. So, to pull it all together, in the Citizens Project, we pulled it all under and we called it the Early Childhood Education Wrap. So we could wrap it out in a song, or we can wrap our arms around the children and families. When we looked at what pulls it all together for good support for families, there were three things that leapt out at us. The relationships, the attitudes of people in those relationships, and the provisions that make the relationships possible, hence the wrap. And for us, looking at those things, you have to pull them together in terms of the three components of teachers, any other support workers that may be attached to or around the families, and the management of the Early Childhood Centre all come together under relationships, attitudes and provisions to enable enhanced outcomes that are embedded in the family, because we want good outcomes that are sustainable, that aren't actually only going to last while you're physically around them, but in fact will remain when they have moved well on and beyond the Early Childhood Centre. So to summarise, the relationships, the factors that work, the relationships were about meaningful and clear communication with parents, reciprocity was in the relationships, and as I've said earlier, that appropriateness and timing of support was crucial. And for the teachers and the families to have mutual interests. And it's there already because you both like their child. Attitudes, ease and comfort in a place. Early childhood centres being non-stigmatised settings. That the goals are shared between parents and children. And that in fact, teachers see families from a strength-based model, not just the individual child. And the provisions, well, as I've said, being there in the suburb is already an advantage. Linking, networking, getting to know others is crucial. And having a shared context where, in fact, again, you've got that mutual interest, those shared contexts enable support to be more easily accessed. Having said that, there are challenges, of course, to reconceptualising relationships, and not every centre was the ideal model for it, I've already flagged to you that teacher instability, non-sustainable early childhood centres put all of these factors at risk. If we have parents who do not see early childhood as a place that they can feel welcome or comfortable, then all of the stuff I've been talking about is not going to touch them at all. We also have some teachers who don't see their role at all as working with families, strange as that may sound. But there are some staff out there who see their role first and foremost as I'm there teaching the child, the little lone scientist. And it'd be really kind of nice if the parent just actually left them at the gate, actually, but I do have to at least let them in the door. There are still some hangovers of last century belief that teaching is just about me and the child and not the family. For us to change the way that we work, we're also going to have to show those who own centres that in fact this way of working is by far the best, not only for their business, but in fact for the community and the sustainability of the community who's going to use their business. There are also some challenges in the way that other agencies work with early childhood centres and families. Not all of our social agencies at this time have a collaborative approach to working with children and families. Not all of them have a collaborative approach to early childhood education. Not all of them even like early childhood education. There are many GPs I hear that tell people not to put their children into early childhood education because they'll get too sick. So we've still got a long way to go to even get everybody thinking that early childhood is a good place for children, let alone a good place for families. Just about right for time for questions. So my final comment really is to think quite carefully about whether you think that early childhood education is and can be the glue in a community. And if it can, and if it does, then how do we make sure that all our families, irrespective of whether they're in a full-day program, a sessional program, whatever kind of program you imagine, how can we make sure that all our families are going to benefit from them? And that's it.
Well, it's quite hard work, this teaching in early childhood, isn't it? Goodness, and this is only one part of it. I'm sure that there are some questions, so I'm just going to help Judith field those. Yeah, because I just found that absolutely fascinating. So do we have any questions? I had one that was kind of burning in my mind, and it was, you know, I can remember saying to students, you're only a teacher, you're not a social worker, you're not anything else, you're a teacher, and be very careful about treading into the domain. And I think that that's a really a tension that kind of concerns me, I guess, a little bit. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because in fact, and maybe I haven't described it very well today at all, because in fact that what was happening in all of these centres that I've talked to you about today is just good teaching practice. So none of them were social workers in that sense, but they were all exceptionally good teachers who had their antennas up for what was going on in families' lives. So they were referrals. So when a social worker was needed, they were referral. They were the buffer, because they were sometimes the person that said, actually, that's not okay to the social worker, and in fact we'll find someone else. So they played those roles of mediator, buffer, referral, but a lot of what went on was just good teaching practice. It was building those strong relationships with families, not just the child. It was actually saying, morning, how are you today, was enough for some. One of the findings actually that came particularly from the full-day childcare centres, and that always sends a ripple in the room, was that one of the findings that was just absolute was that the provision of a hot home-cooked meal served up by the childcare centre was identified for some of these families as the best thing that centre could do to support their families. And I know that we have a trend at the moment where children bring lunch boxes, and the good old cooked, catered meal is disappearing from early childhood centres. But I would add that, in fact, if we're looking at wanting to address child poverty, if we want to look at child obesity, and we actually want to set up some good, strong eating habits, I would really like to see centres out there going back to their catered hot meals. The parents said that it really made a difference because for two things. A, it meant they didn't have to buy so many groceries at home. So this is a good thing. But more importantly, because they knew their child had eaten really well at lunchtime, because you know how kids always eat when they're sitting with other children, they didn't have to fight with them at tea time. It didn't matter if they had cheese on toast for tea, because they knew they'd had a really good meal through the day. So that night time at home, when they'd been picked up at 5, wasn't that huge stress of, I've got to go home, I've got to cook tea, and this kid's got to eat it before they go to bed. They were actually able to engage in jam sandwiches and conversation.
Thank you. I think Ali's got a question.
Yeah, Judith, great. Loved your presentation. I wonder if you would comment on what are the implications for redeveloping our initial teacher education program. You know, what are we doing right and what do we need to change in terms of preparing teachers?
Oh. Stop recording. I think that's a really good question, Ali. And for those at the back, it was, you know, should we be thinking about reconceptualising initial teacher education? And my answer to that is yes. I think Linda's point's absolutely right. We've got this huge long list of what early childhood teachers need to do. But again, I don't think we add to the list. My third year sitting down the row in the front here, we had a conversation the other day about being a researching practitioner didn't mean you added it on to your day. It meant it was the lens that you carried through in your day. And so I would argue that this approach to teaching doesn't mean you're doing more. It means you're just doing it slightly more intentionally when it comes to the parents and the families. We've always had it in the back of our mind, you know. Many of us have worked really hard to remember the names. I always think I've done really well when I've remembered everybody's parent's name. And we've done really well to know when someone's sick, or we've done really well to know when there's been a marriage breakup, or, you know, the kind of big things, because, you know, you've got a weeping mother that you can't ignore really, and you've got upset children. We've done a really good job at those times. But what I'm talking about here is actually seeing our centres as the glue for the community, so that in fact parents are as welcome to be there as much as their children. So it is a very different way of thinking about collaborative teaching and being parts of communities. We know it works, but we've also got to have those provisions in place to enable it to work too, which is support of employers, sustainability of centres, so they are going to stay in the suburbs and not disappear next week.
Since Judith joined our team, she often says to us, don't work harder, work smarter, and I think that's what she's talking about. That's her, I think it's her favourite saying. Okay, any other questions? We have one here.
You made a comment about replicating parent involvement if the parent can't be there. What sort of initiatives and things have you seen out there that help that when you've got parents who can be there for 5 minutes or...
Yes. Oh, that's a really tough question. So how do we do it when they can only stay for 5 seconds? Yeah. Now, several of the models that are going are doing a lot of more of using ICT for connecting people. So setting up websites, setting up slideshows when they come in, doing a whole lot of connecting people through cyberspace, which sounds a bit kind of strange, but in fact, parents at work can always answer an email or look at a quick photo in a way that they don't have time to do when they're picking their child up or dropping them off. So there's been quite a lot of that kind of stuff going on to engage parents, because step one is actually to engage them so that they actually are interested in what's going on for their child and interested in getting to know you as staff. So that's kind of the first point. Then, in fact, the Citizens Centre that I was involved in, we did quite a lot of family gatherings. that were held at very odd times of the day and night and weekends, to try and bring parents together. And they were moderately successful. I wouldn't say they're hugely successful, but they were moderately successful. And actually they were successful for the families we needed them to be successful for. So again, I don't think there's a recipe, because it's about being responsive to the community that you're in. So for some families and communities, the ICT thing would be a good entree. For other parents, you'd be wasting your time. So it's about engaging with your parents and your other staff, obviously, and actually finding out what are going to be the best ways of trying to replicate some of these things that happen more naturally in a sessional program where people can hang out. So I don't know if that helped you at all, actually, but filled in the time.
There's a question here from our cameraman.
Just to follow up that question there, the parents that drop their children off for childcare, do you find, you talk about parental involvement, do you find there's a socio-economic skew on that, and that the people that need to drop their children for childcare to get to work and then pick them up afterwards just don't have time for those cups of tea and the involvement, nor often will they have access to a computer, for instance? Did you find a skew in your findings with the people that were involved? Were they from a certain...
Yeah, no, well, some of the findings are skewed because we deliberately went to centres where parents were seen to be in the highly deprived areas, because we wanted to know what it was about those centres that teachers were already doing as everyday practice that was doing such great stuff in their community. So we've had a kind of bias sample from that particular study. But in terms of the other studies, no, you can't kind of connect it at all to socioeconomic status. The difference is the amount of time that people have in their lives generally. Because I think most of us know that, in fact, a lot of things are having a drop-off. You know, Girl Guides, Scouts can't get people to volunteer their time. You know, with the increase in the work culture and certainly the 60-hour week instead of the 40-hour week, there are fewer opportunities to be grabbed for those things. I think there is a bit of a skew there, but probably not one that you're thinking of. Yeah.
I'd just like to comment on the fact of parent involvement. That just because our parents aren't having time to spend in the centre, an early child will be seen home asking for parent voices, and quite often the parent involvement is actually with their child at home. So there's a level of parent involvement. You know, it's not just that parents aren't being involved in what's actually happening and having time to spend in the centre, but they may involve themselves in other areas.
So did you guys hear that at the back? I would agree with you, but if we're talking about the benefits of connection and community and being part of something that isn't just your immediate family, then I would certainly like to see more than that happen. And you know, for some of the stuff that I haven't put up there at all were parents talking about how they had moved into an area that they didn't know anybody at all, how hideous it had been, and then they went to the childcare centre, the kindergarten, and suddenly they had friends and people that could look after their children, people they could go to the park with in the weekends. One mother talked about how they had a tragic situation where they had a baby not very long after they arrived in this particular place, and the baby died. And she said that for 6 to 8 weeks they never cooked a meal. She couldn't believe the way the entire early childhood community just stepped up to the plate and just completely looked after that family, and took she had a 3-year-old, and the 3-year-old was always going off and playing and having a fabulous time while the parents had time to grieve and to put all the pieces together. And when she was talking to me about it, you know, she just said she had never ever expected complete strangers to suddenly turn up with whole meals for them and all sorts of other gifts, but it was all part of being part of that community. So, yeah.
Look, I've got heaps of questions. I don't know why. Sorry. But I have 2 questions. One, I had a question about whether you've been able to look at whether there's a different perception for teachers who work in community-based centres as opposed to private childcare, and so whether there's a different philosophy about involving families and involving parents. And the other question I had was what cultural differences you might have noticed about wanting to be involved and wanting the teachers to be involved in their lives. Sorry, they're two quite big ones.
Yes, but I can do it quite quickly. All of the services were community-based.
Yeah, I know that, and so... Yeah.
How odd is that?
Have you got an opinion?
Have I got an opinion? These were all community-based. And they were doing a really good job. In terms of cultural differences, there were the communities that we've had, and I'm racing through my studies in my head. We had Pacific Islands, Pacifica, Māori, a small amount of Asian parents, and there was no difference in terms of the importance of being welcomed and feeling a part of the place. There would have been a slight difference in terms of how much they wanted the teachers to know about what was going on at home. But in terms of being part of something that was bigger than just their family, and being part of something in the community, held true for everybody actually. Yeah.
Well, I think we're pretty close to on the button. So I want to thank you, Judith, for sharing this amazing research that you've been involved in, and for sharing it in such an interesting way. I could tell that people were really focused, and that's pretty good for 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So yeah, thanks so much for being a colleague and being willing to share this with this audience. Could people just show their appreciation, please?
Now I can turn myself off.